Welcome to Lesson 3 in the WPF with MVVM add-on course. In this lesson, we're going to set up the main form in our application. We're going to set the initial layout of our shell and then wire up the tournament list. So let's get started. Here we have our shell view. Let's start with this open. I'll rearrange things to make it a little more logical for the video. Now the basic idea here is I want to have on this left-hand side a strip that is going to be all of our existing tournaments. So you can just click on one and it will load over here on the right. I also want a button maybe at the top, since it's the first thing you want to think about doing, and that is to create a new tournament. So create a new tournament and then all the existing tournaments. I also want some kind of header up here saying tournament tracker or some way of identifying that's what this is. And then this section right down here, the kind of lower right-hand corner, which is really most of the screen, I want to reserve for all those different views we're going to load into this shell. So that's kind of the idea behind it. And so we're going to play around with how to get this to look right no matter what, as far as if the form gets bigger or smaller. So let's start off with the row definition and column definition. So the column definitions. We'll start off with our border. Let's make it a 20 pixel border. That's my standard border, really. And then I'll copy that and I'll paste it 2 times and make this one in here auto. So I want this first column to be auto, and that's after the 20 pixel border. May make it smaller, we'll see. But the first column after this border should be an auto width. And then after that, I want the rest of the screen taken up with that form. So I'm just going to make one auto column and then one column that is the star width. Star being everything left over. So really just 4 columns. Let's go to rows. And we'll start off with our same 20 pixel wide or high row. There we go. And let's create the first one, the last one, and the middle one. I'm going to want the first one to be auto. And the next one after that, same deal. I want it to be the star. And we can always add more columns later. So if you say, you know what, that's view, go to the view model, build out all of our properties we're going to need, and then come back and create the corresponding items on the page. And that's a good way of doing things. It really is, because it does tell you where things need to be or what things need to be on the form. But I kind of like to rough in the form and make sure I like how it looks, because I might change controls or I might change how things work. And that might have a bearing on how my data in the back end will be connected or what data comes in. So I kind of like just to have that feel for this is what the form's going to look like. Now let's go create the proper properties and methods to use it or to utilize it. So let's start off with creating our header. So I'm going to say text block And this is really going to be simple. It's going to be grid dot row 1 and grid dot column 1, and we're going to do a column span. We're going to span this to be 2 columns wide. So right now it'll be in column 1 where it's going to start, but I want it to go into this star width column as well. And we're going to make this be centered. So our horizontal alignment equals center. And I'll actually move that down to the next line. And our content is going to be tournament tracker. So that's kind of like our header, just to show off that this form is the tournament tracker. And because we want to make that a header, let's make it a little bit bigger. So I'll add in a font size change. And let's make this, the default font is 18. So let's make this 28 and see how it looks. That looks better. Now you may be thinking, man, that's actually not a big form. We can actually change that by changing the height and the width. So let's change the width to be something at least a little more reasonable for a startup project, say 600, which makes it a little harder to see on the screen. We can actually zoom on the form to change this to, let's try 100%. There we go. So now the form is a little more visible in our viewing area, and yet it's a little wider in the actual startup width. We can change the height too if we wanted to. Something like that. So we can start there. We can actually make adjustments as we need to on this form. When we actually run it, it will start at 500 by 600. But we can adjust this to be any size we want, depending on the needs of our screen and what we have available to us. Now before we were looking at 148% resolution for our form, and so it looked nicer. I do think that the tournament tracker header might be a bit small, so let's change that to be a little bit bigger. Let's go something more like, let's do 36. That's a little more bold. We'll address the 18 font size if it becomes an issue. The thing we don't want is font so tiny it can't be read. We also don't want font so huge we can't. White space below the button. So let's do this. Let's create a stack panel. And a stack panel just allows us to stack things together and yet treat the overall stack panel as one object. So I create a stack panel. I'm going to say the orientation is vertical. And I want this to be in grid column. Let's start there. Column 1. At 1. There we go. Grid.row is 1. And then I'm also going to want to say grid.row span is 2. So I want it to start over here and go this way, down, vertically. Now you may notice that I'm kind of stepping the toes of my label. They both start in column 1 of row 1. And this is a design preference, how you want to do this. One way, the way I'm doing it right now, and I may change it, but the way I'm doing it right now, yes, I'm stepping on each other's toes because this is centered and it's okay because there's white space over here. The benefit here is now my tournament tracker is always in the very middle of the form. So it doesn't matter how big the form gets, that tournament tracker is going to be accurately centered on the form. However, as the form gets smaller, that tournament tracker will crunch down into this column. When it does, it will actually be on top of or underneath our stack panel, so our button. So you might see the button over the first few letters of tournament in Tournament Tracker. That might not be ideal. So it really depends on if you want to do that or not. If you say, I just don't want to have that ugly look, and I expect my form to get that small, then what you need to do instead is start your Tournament Tracker in column 2 and not do a column span. The benefit there is it will never overlap with our stack panel, but it will also never be centered. Because now, depending on how big this first column gets, that gives less and less space for Tournament Tracker. You can center it in the remaining space, but that's not really the same thing as having it centered in the form. So it really depends on what you feel is the better option for your design. I'm not going to stress out over it. I'm going to create one way. If it doesn't work, I can always just change this grid dot column to 2 and take the column span away. So it's not a big deal to change. So let's start this way. So I've got a vertical stack panel starting in column 1, row 1, and going down our rows. Right between button and list box, put a text block. So it really is quick and easy to add these as you see fit. Okay, the last thing we want to add to our form, and it really is that simple, is we want to add a content control. And we'll say grid.row is 2, and grid.column is 2. And we'll close it for now. So that's going to live in this box right here. And that will be our create tournament form, or it will be the view tournament form based on if we click the create tournament button or one of the existing tournaments. And that's really all there is to this form. The button to launch a new tournament, the list of existing tournaments, and then the view of the actual content. Now let's set up our shell view model. So we need a couple things. We're going to need a method. Let's call this create tournament. And this will be wired up to our button, our create tournament button. So we can actually at this point just copy this name and then come over to our button and say x:name equals create tournament. We don't need, in this instance, a can create tournament method. And the reason why is because we can always create a tournament. There's not really a limit to, or a rule to say, here's when you can create a tournament, here's when you can't. So there's no reason to have that can method, since the button will always be enabled. So there's our method for that. Now we need our property for our existing tournaments. So let's do a prop full. And we'll say this is a bindable collection. And the type is going to be tricky. We don't have a type yet. So let's just say object for now. We'll go back and fix it later. And we'll say existing tournaments. And we'll call this existing tournaments. So the reason I don't have a type yet is that I haven't actually bound up and said the tracker library is connected to this user interface. So let's do that. Let's add a reference in our projects for tracker library. This is where library in the name really helps. Otherwise, we might accidentally add the tracker UI, and that'd be a problem. All right, so we've added a reference to our class library, and now we can add a using statement using tracker library. And instead of object, we can go and look for the correct type. So if we go to iDataConnection, the get tournaments _all returns a tournament model. So that's actually what we're looking for, is a tournament model. And it's going to yell at us because we don't have a using statement for tracker library.models. There we go. So now we have, and I put that in the entirely wrong spot. So let's change that. Wrong object. So I'll put the object That's no big deal. We don't need that. But we do need our right here. This line right here. So global config.connection.get tournaments _all. So let's copy this line. And then we'll go back to our shell view model and say existing tournaments equals, and it's going to yell at us. And the reason why is because it can't convert our list to a bindable collection. Now, when you're working with lists like this, you may go, oh no, we got a mess. What are we going to do? Don't panic. That's really the key for all programming. But there's actually a really simple way to get around this. But if there wasn't, what we could do is actually use link and say, this list dot for each, and then add each one to the existing tournaments list, which, by the way, is not initialized. We need to take care of that. And actually, we're going to kill two birds with one stone, because the initialization is what will actually set us up for adding this properly. So if we were to say equals new bindable collection, notice it actually has an overload. There's two different constructors for this. The blank constructor, and then a constructor that takes an IEnumerable collection. Well, the IEnumerable collection, one of the IEnumerables is a list. So I can just pass in the list creation right into the constructor. It will take that list and then use that to populate the bindable collection. Piece of cake. Now, this is the first time you've talked about actually accessing data from our class library. If you remember, there's a little bit of code we need to do before we do anything else in our class library. So let's go back over to our tracker UI, which is kind of like our model that we're starting from, our starting point. And let's look at program.cs. And right down here, we have initialize the database connections. We need to do this once for our entire application to make sure that we're pointing to one of our two options for database connection. So let's copy this line. And the question is, where do we put this in our WPF application? We could probably put it in Bootstrapper, maybe even on Startup or Initialize, but I'd like to keep that free and clear from that kind of stuff. Instead, let's put it right in the constructor of our shell view model. And the reason why is because this constructor will get called first of our entire application. So once everything else is set up and it launches the first form, it's going to launch this shell view model and thus this constructor. So therefore, that should launch. We can get rid of tracker library, don't need it. That should launch and set up our database connection to use SQL right from the start for our entire application. So now our bindable list seems to be set up right. We can test this in just a little bit, and testing is good. So the quicker you get the testing, the better. So the way we're going to set up testing is we actually need to bind this to our list box. So let's go back to, let's close out this other stuff we don't need. And go back to our shell view. And we're going to say that our list box name, x:\name, equals existing tournaments. And the only other thing we need to do right away before anything else is we need to have the display member path. Now remember, this is one property inside of our list that we want to have displayed in our list box. So we come back over here to our shell view model and look at the tournament model. We can hit F12. We need to pick one property from here, and that property would be tournament name. That's a good one to have. So we'll close this out, go back over to our shell view, and say the display member path is tournament name. Now we still want to wire up our selected item at some point soon, because otherwise we won't actually be doing anything when a selection is made. But for now, is getting the data to pass in the constructor for that. So since this is all in one line, it makes it a little more difficult to debug, but if you look through it, you'll see that global config.connection isn't set up. So why isn't it set up when in our constructor we initialize it? And that right there is the clue. The reason it's not set up is because this right here happens before the constructor. So setting up our variables and any of the initial values, the starting values, happens before we run the constructor. Therefore, we have not yet initialized our database when we're asking to use it. So how do we solve that? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Let's copy this right here from existing tournaments to the end. I'm going to copy it. So let's go look at existing tournaments. We'll actually put the breakpoint after existing tournaments and run this again and just inspect this existing tournaments. And according to this, the shell view model never actually hit the constructor. And the reason why is because this isn't the constructor. And if you've been yelling at me for the past 10 minutes that I call this a constructor when it's not the constructor, kudos to you. If you haven't, then yell at me because this is ridiculous. All right. For whatever reason, I read create tournament and thought, oh, that's a constructor. It's not. That is for the button create tournament. Now, just for giggles, what would happen if I hit create tournament? Object reference not set to an instance of an object. All right, so it's looking for our tournaments connection string and can't find it. That's because we've not set up app.config. So I tell you what, before you do anything else, I kind of want to leave it this way just because it really would work, or at least it should, because it's wired up to the button. I want it to be in the constructor, but it's wired to the button for right now. In the meantime, though, let's actually change my config file. So if we look at our tracker UI's app.config, we'll see that I have a connection string here. And in fact, we also have the system.net mail settings. We're probably going to need those as well. So let's copy those as well. And we also have these does seem to have something, but it's not actually populating this list. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to change this to constructor because, again, this is ridiculous that I have it in the button when it shouldn't be here. But we now know the button's wired up properly. So it is calling this method. Woohoo. So CTOR, paste that in. Now I've made a change. It shouldn't work, but I'm going to start it anyways just to see if it works. It actually does. So the difference here is that on startup, it's loading this list before we get to actually displaying it. And since it does that, I think the reason why it shows up now is because before it actually does a binding, the list is in place. If we click the button, the binding's been in place, and now we're updating the list, and that's what causes the problem, I think. So that's a little bit of guesswork on my part. You can do some trial and error there. If you really wanted to have it on a button and not in the constructor, then what you'd probably need to do is do a notify a property change. So now we have our list of tournaments, which is kind of cool. It's kind of ugly, but it's kind of cool. And we also have our create tournament button. Now they're kind of crunched together. That's kind of ugly. And the actual list itself is pretty hideous. But at least it's working the way it's supposed to in the fact that it's pulling data from our database and displaying it here. So the first thing I'll do is I'll probably put a space here. I do think I'll put that header there that says existing tournaments, just so we have something visually to kind of indicate what's going on. So let's do that. So let's go here. And I'm going to shrink this over so I can see more of my stack panel. And I'm going to say, first of all, text block. Doesn't need a name. Doesn't need anything else. I'm just going to call this existing tournaments. And I might actually make this bold. So font weight equals bold. There we go. And it is still crunched up. If you can see over here on the left, it's still crunched up against this button. Not a big fan of that. I don't mind it being crunched up against the list because it's sitting right on top of the list, and that's cool. So what I'm going to do is I am going to add a margin. I'm going to say 0, 10, 0, 0. And what that does is it puts a 10 pixel margin above it. So it starts left, top, right, bottom. So if we want more on the top, I just say 20 and it moves it down even further. But I think for now, we'll stick with 10 and see how that looks. So we'll run this again. And there we go. It's a little better. It's a little cleaner, a little nicer, and I can live with it at least. Again, it's not pretty, but at least it's in place, and we can work all you want on making it a little prettier as we go down the road. Now the next thing I want to do is actually know which item here, if any, is selected. So let's go back to our shell view model, and we'll add that property as well. So prop full. And we'll say this is of type tournament model. And we'll call this selected tournament. And then what we'll do is we will set our set property. Let's expand this out. We'll do the notify a property change. For the selected tournament. So now we have this selected tournament. We can come back over here to our shell view and Nothing happens. So let's make sure we wire this up to properly do selection. And the reason it doesn't work is because we didn't actually say do anything to put a value in selected tournament. So in our list box, let's actually go a new line here. We need to say selected item equals, we do our binding, path equals selected tournament, mode equals one way to source. We can do that. That's all we need to do. Hopefully, we run this. And now if we say basketball tournament, it says basketball tournament down here. Now, I'm going to blow away this field. I don't need it. I don't want it. And I have no use for it. But I did have a use for it right now. You see, I made a small change to my application. I added the selected tournament property. But I had no real way of testing it right now. I can test it later when I actually want to use it. But that's going to be a few lessons down the road. That's going to be a few hours down the road. So even if I were to build this application, in one day and I'm working on it, it's still, if I start before lunch, it's still after lunch before I had one spot that I had modified that wasn't working. So I could look at that one spot to fix it. So that's it. I just want to make sure that I explain why I did that and why it's good for you to do that. Every time you can make a change, if you can test it, do. It just makes it a whole lot easier to figure out any problems you have. All right, so now I have my user interface pretty much done. I don't have anything yet wired up for the actual form because I have no forms to put into it. Now we'll change that in just the next lesson, but for right now, we have nothing to put in there, so there's nothing to wire up. We have nothing to really wire up for this button except for the fact that we know that the button works. And we tested that because I thought it was a constructor. My bad. But in the end, it actually did do us a little bit of good to make sure we knew the button worked. We do know that the list works because we've actually seen it in place. We've also tested to make sure that the selected item in the list works as well. So this form is really set to go on. Now, the only thing this form does right now is list our tournaments. But once we start building forms, we can at least use this spot to display those forms inside of our main form. And then once we create the create project or create tournament form or the display tournament form, we can put those in here and actually wire up one of the buttons. So that'll come, but for right now, the form is complete as it is. All right, so that's all for this lesson. In our next lesson, we're actually going to tackle the prizes, the create prizes form. So a little bit of departure from where we are right now, and it's not really connected yet, but that's okay. We have our path to get to the end result. And we're kind of following the same pattern we did in the WinForm user interface design. So up next, create new prizes.